says in Daniel chapter 11, starting in verse 10, it says, "However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army of much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power." And that's the key verse right there. The glorious land, speaking of Israel, the promised land, which this is all centered around. And even in the time that we live in, you think of the wars that are happening now, it's all centered around Israel. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or be for him. After this he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall take many. But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches. It's kind of like, who is that guy in Disney? Huh? He steals from the rich to give to the poor? Robin Hood. There we go, Robin Hood. It's like Robin Hood. Maybe it's not Disney, I don't know. And he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And the forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation, which we have already discussed. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. You guys can grab a seat. So many years are transpiring through these events. Many different people are transpiring through these events. You know, a lot of who we're going to be discussing tonight really stems from Alexander the Great. which we talked about last week. Alexander the Great being a reference here in verses 3 and 4. If you look back in verse 3 and 4, it says, "Then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." So that's a reference to Alexander the Great to come after Daniel. We know of him. We study him in our history classes. We see of really how mighty this guy was to be able to overtake the entirety of the world just in a matter of like 4 years. Really, really powerful. And he dies at a young age. We know this. We've discussed this. And he dies, I think, younger than me. And his kingdom is not divvied up amongst his children, but amongst his generals, amongst his 4 generals. And so all the people and the kings that we're going to be reading of stem really from these 4 generals. And the 4 generals being Cassander, who ruled in Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus, who ruled in Bithynia and Asia Minor, Seleucus, he took Syria and the lands that were to the east. And this will be actually when we refer to the king of the north, it's Seleucus and his family, his kids, and the kids that take over the kingdom after him and so forth. So again, this is the kingdom that is north of Israel. So when Daniel refers to it as the king of the north, it's not Seleucus per se, it's whoever is reigning in that time that is the king of the north. It's not just one specific person. Then the 4th general is Ptolemy, who is going to rule in Egypt, Palestine, Arabia, and this is going to form the kingdom that is known as the South Kingdom. So again, this kingdom is south of Israel. And so Daniel is sharing these things with us, about 200 years before they even happen. But all the kings that we're going to be reading of and all the kingdoms stem from these 4 guys, the 4 generals of King Alexander the Great. So let's start here in verse 10. Do you guys remember what happened in verse 8 and 9? That crazy story? Or 6, 7, 8, 9. Remember that whole family situation? It was like Maury or Jerry Springer, right? Yeah. So verse 6, let's actually look at it really quick. So it says, "At the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army into the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail." So what ends up happening is the king of the south, Ptolemy II, if you remember this, he has a daughter named Bernice. They make an alliance between Egypt and Syria. Bernice is going to marry the new king of the north, who is Antiochus II. But after that, because of that, he divorces his wife, Laodice, however we pronounce her name. And this was a very common thing, these marriages between royal families, to bring about peace treaties, stuff like that. But Bernice and her marriage to Antiochus didn't last long. Okay, so in a few years, the king of the south, Ptolemy, he dies. Then the king of the north, Antiochus, he ends up taking back his first wife. But his first wife wasn't happy that, her husband divorced her to marry this other girl. So what she ends up doing is she ends up killing the other girl as well as her children. And then she turns around and poisons her husband. You guys remember this story? So the king of the north dies, Antiochus II, and then her son, the woman who's doing all this killing, ends up being made the king, and this is Seleucus II. Okay, and that's where we see this, or then we see this in verse 7. "But from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army." And this is a reference to Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III. Okay, and he would overtake Egypt, raise up an army, and come up against Seleucus II, who was the daughter of the woman who was killing everyone, if you guys remember this. So, verse 9, "Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land." So, Seleucus II, he ends up mounting a return attack to Egypt in 240 BC. he was defeated, so he retreats back to his own land. But what we talked about and we ended with last week is every time these things are happening between the north and the south, they're trekking through one central place, which is Israel, right? So all these things are happening through Israel. And, what we came to understand was that God truly cares about Israel, even in the midst of all of this. Israel's in the middle of it, yet God is protecting them. He is guiding them. He knows them. He loves them. He has not forgotten them, even in the midst of all the chaos. To people who are in the midst of it, they may think otherwise, but God is showing himself faithful. So verse 10 says, however, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. So the sons here are the sons of Seleucus II. Remember, he was the son that was raised up by the woman who killed everyone. And his sons are Seleucus III. That's how that works, right? And Antiochus III. So you have these two sons, and they're going to stir up strife. Seleucus III, he ends up taking over for his father in 227 BC, and then he dies like 4 years later. And then his brother, Antiochus III, then becomes king of the north. Verse 11, then the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. So now we're going to the king of the south. And that king is Ptolemy IV. Okay? He is the king of the south. And he attempts to recapture the lost territory of the north by attacking the southern borders of Israel in 217 BC. He raises up an army of 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and about 70 elephants. It's amazing. The things that you have to use when you don't have the technology. And this is why I was referring to Lord of the Rings last time. You guys remember Lord of the Rings? When you've seen it, you remember the elephants in them? Yeah, that was a blessing if you had the elephants. So the king of the south, Ptolemy, he ends up defeating the king of the north, which is that reference here at the end of verse 11 where it says, he shall be given into the hand of his enemy. So verse 12, when he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. So because of this victory, Ptolemy IV became puffed up, became prideful, but he ended up not capturing Antiochus. And so his victory didn't feel like it was complete. That's why it's a reference to he will not prevail. Verse 13 and 14 and 15. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. So now it's about 201 BC. Okay, we've got like 10, 15 years that have passed by. Antiochus III, he's recovered from his defeat. Remember, he was not captured. So he rises up again with another army, a larger one this time. He prepares to attack Egypt again, but this time he's joined by some of the Jews who are living in Palestine. Okay? Those that violently oppose being dominated by the southern kingdom and thought that Antiochus III would free them from the oppression. But really what happens is you go from one person who is going to oppress you to another person who's going to oppress you. So the southern kingdom, who is being ruled by Ptolemy V now, was being pushed out of the Mediterranean port city of Sidon, which is the reference to the fortified city in verse 15, which is on the coast of Palestine on the Mediterranean Sea. So they're losing control of the land of Palestine. Very interesting. We see what's happening now in 2024 and 23 and I think 22. When did the war in Israel start? Was it 22? 23? I think 22, 23, somewhere around there. It's I think you're right. I can't remember, but it's been ongoing. And you've got this battle between Palestine, Israel. We see it happening thousands of years earlier. And so they're losing control of the land of Palestine. So although Antiochus III was victorious, the southern kingdom killed many of the Jews that had partnered together with the north. Verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. And so as Antiochus was defeating the Egyptians, he again takes control over the area of the land that was between Syria and Egypt. He took over the glorious land. What is the glorious land? Israel, right? That is the glorious land. But in the midst of all this, he brings a lot of destruction in the process. So here we have these major world powers at war and tiny little Israel. You guys ever looked at Israel on a map? Yeah? Have you ever seen how little it is? Isn't that, there's something to be said of that? How tiny it is, but yet how powerful they are, and yet how everything is centered around Israel, and you're like, it's not, because it's God's chosen nation, and it's the promised land. It's, as Daniel describes it, the glorious land. There's a reason. It's spiritual, right? There's a spiritual aspect to all of this. So you've got all these world powers at war here, and then you've got this tiny little nation of Israel who is caught in the middle of it all. In verse 17, it says, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, and thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but he shall not stand with him or be for him. And the phrase here, he shall give him, the him is the king of the south, and the daughter is Cleopatra. Not the famous one, not the one you're thinking of. That woman is Cleopatra the seventh, and she is the last pharaoh of Egypt during the days of the Roman Empire, about 150 years after this time. Okay, so when we talk about Cleopatra, it's not the one that you're thinking of. This is the daughter of Antiochus. Cleopatra here is married to Ptolemy V. So Antiochus III, he initiates this peace with Egypt by offering his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V in marriage. Cleopatra did not remain loyal to Syria. However, her father did not gain dominance over Egypt, and so Cleopatra sided with her husband against her father, although Ptolemy V was only a young man of 17. So they propose this marriage. They go through with the marriage to bring alliance, but eventually she ends up siding with her then husband and not with her father. And that's what all that reference is in verse 17. But she shall not stand with him or be for him, a reference to her father. Verse 18, after this he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Now the ruler here is the Roman commander Lucius Cornelius Scipio. Antiochus III directed his attention toward Asia Minor and Greece, where the Romans had authority, yet he failed because Lucius Cornelius defeated him in 190 BC in the Battle of Magnesia near Smyrna. I want to encourage you guys, when you get older, when you have the money and the time, go overseas, go check this stuff out. It's pretty amazing. Not all of it is still standing, but you can see remnants of a lot of things. With America, things are only a couple hundred years old. We're literally talking about things that are before Christ, and yet some of these things still exist, right? They're like remnants of it, not in perfection, but remnants of it. And Whitney and I got to see some of the stuff in Greece when we went, and it really puts it in perspective. I really hope one day that I can go to Israel and actually see those things, and I would encourage you to if you could. So verse 19 says, then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. So finally, Antiochus III, he was killed in his own land when he was trying to steal the treasures of a Babylonian temple in Elam, which is now in modern southern Iran. So all this is happening, right? All this is happening. The Jews are getting involved. Some are not getting involved. It's surrounding them. Their people are passing through their land. And you have, probably these small group of Jews living in Israel thinking, as they studied these writings of Daniel, right, they're reading them, and they're tracking these things happening. Could you imagine what that would be like? I mean, we can imagine in the sense that we're looking at it now and we've seen it happen. It's already happened. But imagine in that time things unfolding before your very eyes. And I think what this encourages us and encourages them to do is to trust God at His word. And I know it's hard. It's hard because of our flesh. It's hard because it goes against our nature of humans. It goes against, Satan and what he wants for us to do. But if we can trust God and His word, our lives are going to be so much more immensely blessed. Things that are going to be provided for us, like the peace, and the mercy and the grace that we so desperately need, if we can trust in His word. And I think that's why we get prophecy. It's one of the reasons that we get prophecy, is so that we can trust God in His word. Because if we don't trust God in His word, then we can't trust in Him. Right? Because in the beginning, how did God create things? With His spoken word. Right? Well, then we get into John chapter 1. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Like, it's so vital. We can't say, I trust in you, God, but I don't trust in your word. You can't disconnect the two. They're one and the same. It's how we come to know who He is through His word. And so He wants to, I think, build us up and encourage our faith by, now looking back and seeing, okay, you were faithful to your word. You knew these things to come. So when you tell me in Romans that all have fallen short of the glory of God, then I'm going to believe that. But I'm also going to believe Romans 10:9 when you tell me that if I confess with my mouth and I believe in my heart that the Lord has saved me and risen from the dead, that I'll be saved, I'd trust in that too. When you tell me in Proverbs this piece of wisdom, when you tell me this here or there, I'm going to trust in that because you've already proven yourself faithful. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 through 10 says this: "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure." If God says it, it will happen. It's not like you and I, where we struggle with our yes being yes and our no being no. It's not like you and I where we're finite. It's not like you and I where, not only can I not tell what's going to happen in the future, I can't even remember what happened yesterday, right? Well, God's not that way. He remembers the beginning. He was there. He is the beginning, but He also knows the end because He is the end. So if the scriptures, again, are correct about these prophecies in Daniel, things that are now in our past, how accurate do you think they will be about the things that have not yet been fulfilled? And Jesus tells us that one day He's going to come back, right? John chapter 14, verse 1. "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." He's promised to come again. And do we trust that? Do we trust that? And again, when we begin to realize that the Bible is a reliable document, we should be willing to trust anything and everything that it says. Verse 20 says, "There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle." So the one who imposes taxes is a reference to Seleucus IV. Antiochus' elder son, Seleucus IV, is the seat of the throne, and he taxed his people heavily to pay for the 15,000 talents. And this was a heavy burden upon the Jews under his reign. And his Jewish tax collector, the name Helidorus, poisoned him because of this burden, just like this verse predicted. Do you see that? How was he destroyed a few days later? Was it in anger? No. Was it in battle? No. It was poison. He didn't die in battle. And so this caused a great persecution on the Jews in the years to come. In verse 21, it says, "In his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue." So when this guy was poisoned and died, Seleucus IV, the transition to the next king didn't go so well. Initially, the infant son of Seleucus, named Antiochus, was named king, But the boy's uncle, Antiochus IV, came from Athens to supposedly act as a guardian over the baby, yet somehow the baby ended up dead, and Antiochus IV ended up on the throne. And Antiochus IV gave himself a nickname, and we talked about him before, and his nickname was Epiphanes. You guys remember that? You remember what that name means? Glorious. Glorious. But the Jews called him Epimanes. Epimanes? I don't know how to pronounce it. Which actually meant madman. And this guy was a madman. So historically, he was a rather insignificant Syrian ruler, but he's going to play an important role in Scripture due to the way that he's going to treat the Jews, and he will also become a rather compelling picture of another future ruler, the Antichrist, which we talked about in Daniel chapter 8, where Antiochus Epiphanes corresponds to the little horn. Remember the little horn in the vision of chapter 8, verses 9 through 12, and foreshadowing of the little horn in chapter 7, verse 8. Not a good guy. And that's where the abomination of desolation comes into place, and that's why he's a picture of the Antichrist to come. So verse 22, with the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. So Antiochus, he mounted several successful military campaigns, and the angel here mentions that among these casualties will be the prince of the covenant. This is a reference to one that would be in the highest position of the Jews' covenant relationship with God. As history unfolded, this turns out to be the high priest Onias III. And in 172 BC, Antiochus ordered the murder of the Jewish high priest Onias III, who is the prince of the covenant, and he ends up setting up his own high priest, which is an abomination. In verse 23, and after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. And so about this time, there was a power struggle over who would rule Egypt. Antiochus Epiphanes' father, Antiochus the Great, had sent his daughter Cleopatra again to marry the king of Egypt. The struggle in Egypt is now between two of Cleopatra's sons, who are also Antiochus Epiphanes' nephews. I know it's hard to follow. But Antiochus Epiphanes sides with one of his nephews, Ptolemy VI, but then turns on the nephew and fights against him. In verse 24. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers, and he shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. So Antiochus was able to accomplish what he did because he bribed people. He extended his influence by plundering the wealth and giving it to his followers. So, similar to Robin Hood, but not the same as Robin Hood. Is Robin Hood a real person, or is it just, it's an animal? I don't know. I don't know if it was a reference to a real person. Okay, gotcha. It was a fox, yeah. So that's how Robin Hood came about, was from that original kid story? I don't know. I don't know anything about Robin Hood other than what I saw on Disney with the bear and the fox. But I guess what Robin Hood was trying to do was to take from the rich to give to the poor. And essentially, that is what Antiochus is doing as well, but with the intent to use that money to bribe people. Okay, so you can see the deceit, you can see the wickedness, and the plans that he has. In verse 25, so he shall stir up his power. I want to say something, but it's probably not right to say it, so I won't say it.
Why do you say that you want to say it?
Because I want to say it. Sounds like socialism. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. So when Antiochus, he goes up against Ptolemy VI, the king of Egypt, Ptolemy raised up a large defense force, but he was betrayed by his brother and uncle. His uncle arrests him, while his brother took the throne from him. In verse 26, yet those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So those who ate Ptolemy's delicacies destroyed him. Basically, that's the Bible is saying those were the people who he trusted in. Verse 27, but those kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. So Antiochus and Ptolemy, they sit down at a banquet after the battle, pretending peace, but both were lying to each other. So in the end, the two Egyptian nephews of Antiochus started plotting to work against Antiochus. Verse 28, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. So the king in this verse is the king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus, he returns to Syria after the peace conference with a lot of plunder. He then turns his hatred towards Israel, and he keeps causing grief to the Jews. He did not like the Jews, hated them. And we can see that the heart of Antiochus Epiphanes is probably one of the most wicked hearts that we will see in human history. He hates the Jews, and he hates their relationship with God, and he's soon going to act on that hatred with vengeance. In verse 29, at the appointed time, he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. So the next time Antiochus Epiphanes tries to invade Egypt, he runs into the Romans. And so the Roman council then tells him that if he didn't turn around and leave, well, that he would be attacked by Rome. So the Romans, they make a circle around him. They draw a circle around him, and they tell him to make a decision before stepping out of the circle. Antiochus ends up making a decision to leave, and so he leaves. In verse 30, for the ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So this Roman fleet sails to Egypt to help influence Antiochus. Antiochus was so mad when he leaves, when he makes that decision, that he came all the way to Egypt for nothing, that he ends up taking out his anger and his hatred upon the Jews, and it ends up being that tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered. And this is where we see it get worse in verse 31. And the forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So the abomination of desolation has been brought up once before when we were studying in chapter 8. Again, we brought up Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the picture of the Antichrist to come, and the abomination of desolation that he's going to set up in the future, our future. And so here he is, he's angry, he's bitter, he's mad, and as he's traveling back north, Jerusalem is right on the way home, okay? And so when we talked about in chapter 8, he came against Jerusalem, he forced the Jews to abandon their adherence to the law of God and to conform to the Greek culture in their beliefs. And he ends up committing the abomination of desolation. He puts a statue of the false god of Zeus in the temple, and he sacrifices a pig upon the altar, and he defiles the temple and the priests with its blood. So this is the abomination of desolation, much like what the Antichrist is going to do one day. Verse 32, verse 33 says, those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. So the people who knew their God, who would stand strong, these were the Jews who refused to give in to Antiochus Epiphanes. You got Mattathias Maccabees, who is the father of 5 sons. He is one who refused to do what Antiochus said, and he ends up killing Antiochus' representative. What ends up happening is that he and his sons flee into the mountains, and they begin what we know as the famous Maccabean revolt. You guys know about the Maccabeans? Well, he is the one who started this, and we see this happening here in verse 32. The reference to the people who knew their God, and they shall be strong. The revolt lasted for a while, and many, many people died. And we see that in verse 33. So you have this Maccabean revolt happening in the 2nd century BC, and the Maccabeans, they were fighting for their independence. They were fighting for their independence of Israel. And Antiochus, he ends up killing thousands of Jews in the years following the desecration of the temple, the abomination of desolation. And he ends up dying in Persia in 163 BC. In verse 34, now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. So some of the people who joined the Maccabean revolt and joined the Maccabeans, they weren't necessarily sincere, and they ended up betraying them. In verse 35, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. So this revolt, this resistance against the Greek Syrians, it purifies the Jews. The persecution against the Jews, it ends up running its course. And the angel here gives assurance to Daniel that the persecution would come to an end, because he says it is still for the appointed time. So there would be the further purification in the latter days, which is the mention of the end. It sets the context for a transition in chapter 11 to a far more prophetic event, which has yet not been fulfilled even to our own day. So the point of all this, if there's anything that you can get besides the history of everything that has happened, is that prophecy shows the supernatural nature of the Word of God. And it shows the faithfulness and the truth of the Word of God. The first 35 verses here are remarkable because they are pre-written history. This prophecy is so utterly detailed and accurate that it really staggered anyone who studied it. There's approximately 135 fulfilled prophecies just in these 35 verses alone. 135. And every single one of those fulfilled to us here living in the 21st century. The intricacies of the details of the conflicts between Seleucid and Ptolemies, it really shows the specialty of these prophecies and how amazing all of this is. God knew, He foreordained, He prophesied, it came to pass, and we can trust Him. If we can trust Him again with the things that have come to pass, we can trust Him with the things that haven't been fulfilled yet. And we know that there are still some of these prophecies that have not been fulfilled yet. And as we start next week in verse 36 to the end of the chapter, we're going to talk about those prophecies that have not been fulfilled yet, but yet we're still given to Daniel in Daniel's time. And so I hope you guys be encouraged by that, by God's faithfulness to us.